Good evening. Oh, thank you for giving me your attention so promptly. Welcome to all of our interstate visitors. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you to so many who've travelled from interstate to attend the 35th Samuel Griffith Society Conference here at the Ritz-Carlton at Elizabeth Quay in Perth. My name is Sandra Brewer. I'm the State Member for Cottesloe, the Shadow Treasurer and the Shadow Minister for Women's Interests. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our opening keynote speaker of the conference tonight, the Honourable Richard Court AC, the 26th Premier of Western Australia. Richard is Nedlands born and raised, and he grew up in a political family and graduated from his local University of Western Australia with a Bachelor of Commerce, as did I. He is an accomplished sailor, and in the 60s and 70s, Richard is credited with innovating in the sport. He ventured into business, spending a year with Ford in Detroit, running his own fast food line, Sir Henry's Food Stores, and managing Court Marine until his election into the state parliament at the age of 34. Richard was endorsed by the Liberal Party as the candidate for Nedlands and successfully defended the seat at a by-election in 1982, succeeding his father, the Honourable Sir Charles Court, the 21st Premier of Western Australia. From the opening lines of his inaugural speech, sitting on the opposition benches, Richard believed in the basic need for strong economic management and economic leadership. I recall as a schoolgirl in Bunbury, I looked up to these ideals Richard promoted, and on an excursion to watch a Hamlet play in Perth, I embarrassed my classmates by approaching the front row and asking the member for Nedlands for his autograph. Richard became the leader of the Liberal Party and the leader of the opposition in 1992, a latter role he only held for 9 months, because winning in 1993, Richard became the Premier and Treasurer of Western Australia. He immediately began implementing his plan to restore responsible fiscal administration and budget control following the WA Inc. corruption scandals of the former Labor government. Richard streamlined the public sector, and his industrial relations reform revolutionised productivity, especially in the Northwest and the Pilbara. Richard secured re-election in 1996, and the first time in WA history the Liberal Party won a majority of seats. 9 days after the election, the state regained its AAA credit rating, a major goal of Richard since the beginning. Richard continued to bolster the state's finances, privatising Bank West and the Dampier to Bunbury pipeline. And I salute Richard for being one of the lone state Liberal leaders voicing support for the monarchy at the 1998 Constitutional Conference. Leaving office in 2001, Richard took Western Australia into the 21st century, and his service continued beyond. As part of the 2003 Queen's Birthday Honours, Richard was made a Companion of the Order of Australia for service to the Western Australian Parliament and to the community, particularly the Indigenous community, and in the areas of child health research and cultural heritage, and to economic development through negotiating major resource projects, including the export of gas to China, furthering the interests of the nation as a whole. In 2008, Richard was recognised by Japan, receiving their second highest honour for foreign nationals, the Order of the Rising Sun, Gold and Silver Star for his exceptional contribution to Australia and Japan relations, strengthening our economic ties and ties with Hyogo Prefecture, WA's sister state, whom he supported in the wake of the devastating 1995 earthquake striking Kobe, the first port of call for WA's iron ore. Richard later served as the Australian Ambassador to Japan from 2017 to 2020, a testament to his pioneering efforts in Australian relations with Asia. And outside of his public life, Richard has held several senior positions of directorships, including with BCI Minerals Limited, GRD Limited, IOH Limited, National Hire Group, WestTrac, the Resource Investment Strategy Consultants, the Anglican Diocese Trustees, and the Olympic Team Appeal for Western Australia. Richard is an avid philanthropist with his wife Jo, and I'd personally like to express my gratitude to him for sponsoring my attendance at the 2024 Samuel Griffith Conference through the Sir Charles Court Foundation. Please welcome the Honourable Richard Court, AC.
Sandra, you were very kind. I'd like to acknowledge our President, Alan Myers, and the other board members of the Samuel Griffith Society, Nick Minchin, our chair tonight, all the distinguished members of Parliament and former members of Parliament, and delegates all. For those visiting from the eastern states, a very warm welcome, and you would be pleased to know that Western Australia now has a very vibrant opposition in place, and Sandra's one of those key players. But they are now starting to hold the government to account, and very good for our democratic processes. On a personal note, I'd also just like to add my thanks for the incredible work that John and Nancy Stone have done, not just for the Samuel Griffith Society, but for the nation as a whole. I had some dealings with John and his role in Treasury and the like, and I know later in the conference we'll be hearing more about it. I'm going to miss John's interventions at conference this weekend. At times grumpy, but he was very, he encouraged so much open debate for us. Now, I've been asked to give a paper tonight on industrial relations, and at the outset I would like to make two disclosures. The first, I am not a lawyer. My industrial relations experience is from the School of Hard Knocks, very hard knocks. The second disclosure is that I have great respect for John Howard and his government, some of his former ministers present tonight, and their contribution to public service in our nation. But I never supported their push for a unified industrial relations system in our country, which they finally achieved by using the corporations' powers in our constitution to effectively override the states. I believe they achieved something that Gough Whitlam could only dream of doing, but more of that later. In my final year of a commerce degree at the university here, I had one unit remaining, and that was industrial relations. I decided to do this remotely, and I worked on the early construction of the Mount Newman project in the Pilbara in the late 1960s. I was a truck driver. Accommodation on the site initially was tents around a very old run-down pastoral homestead. And we then eventually moved into dongas, a construction camp, and it was quite an experience. But one day a Transport Workers Union official came to the site and he called us into a meeting during a meal break. At the time it was a relatively small workforce at Newman, and he said that he wanted to formalise the union representation on the site. He wanted to sign us up as members, and were there any volunteers to be the shop steward. Now I thought this would be a good opportunity to learn firsthand how the unions were operating on these construction sites, and I was the only person that put my hand up. After the meeting, I sat down with the official to give him my details. He asked my name. I said it was Richard Court. He asked me, was I any relation to Charlie Court? I said, yes, he is my father. He promptly replied, well, mate, there's no effing way you'll ever join this union, now piss off. So That was the beginning and end of my union career. But ironically, my grandfather was a staunch unionist. He was a member of the Plumbers Union, and my father, Charlie Court, was a life member of the Musicians Union, something that drove the Labor Party mad during his nearly 30 years in politics. He had worked hard on a pro bono basis to try and improve the wages and conditions of musicians, as he himself was a professional musician, as well as being a chartered accountant. My first job out of university, as Sandra mentioned, was in Detroit in the auto industry. I held a temporary position for a few months at a company called American Motors before I started a management training program at Ford. American Motors was struggling to survive. It was eventually brought out by Chrysler. The strong Auto Workers Union, the UAW, wanted to keep the company alive, and when they were doing their wage and conditions negotiations, they were very reasonable with the company. When I started at Ford just a few months later, Ford was in a very strong position in the late 1960s. The Ford Mustang had been a strong success, and that same union, when they were bargaining with Ford, they fought hard for big wage and associated benefit increases. So what I was witnessing then was a strong union that showed flexibility, trying to keep companies in business. They understood that labour and capital both need to make fair returns. In later decades, however, in the US, when the Japanese and the Koreans and the Europeans and even American companies like Tesla themselves, when they were building their auto plants, they tended to go to non-union states to get away from the UAW. On returning to Australia in my early 20s, I decided to start my own small businesses, where I learnt firsthand the challenges of having limited finance and the responsibilities of both employing and managing people. Your own wages were the last to come out at the end of the week. Your assets that you had, not many, were fully mortgaged. And in summary, a challenging but a great learning experience. You quickly develop a broad set of survival skills. When I decided to try and enter politics in 1982, unemployment in this country was above 10%. Youth unemployment was double that. It was unacceptable to me that in a country that had so much natural wealth and a relatively small population, that we had such high unemployment levels. The unions were powerful, they had strangleholds in many sectors, and they pushed for ever higher junior wage rates, which were often making it too hard for our youth to break into the workforce. You've got to start somewhere to gain experience, and it was becoming harder. 25% youth unemployment is unacceptable. I was to spend my first decade in opposition through the WA Inc. In the 80s and the early 90s. In 1993, when we went to a state election, unemployment was again above 10%, youth unemployment as high as 25%. The Pilbara in this state had become highly unionised, with a huge number of restrictive work practices that had become entrenched, and productivity was appalling. From opposition, I watched Charles Copeman address the challenges at Robe River in the mid-1980s, when he had no option but to take drastic action to tackle this situation. If not addressed, Robe would have gone broke, and they were one of the large iron ore companies. Charles Copeman was my industrial relations hero. He realised the problem was not just the militancy of the unions, but the weakness of management over the years in all of the iron ore companies that had allowed so many of these restrictive work practices to become entrenched. When addressed, Robe's productivity went through the roof, but he was facing huge opposition to bring about these changes, as the other major companies in the Pilbara showed reluctance to join him in tackling these issues. In 1992, I became the leader of the opposition, just 9 months out from the 93 election. Our Shadow Minister for Industrial Relations, Graham Griffith, was taking the running on developing our industrial relations policy. He was meeting with industry leaders, with industrial lawyers, with academia. And the concept, when I said meeting with industry leaders, the concept of industry leaders is interesting from my political perspective. There is an industrial relations club where big business and strong unions tend to reach agreement after some argy-bargy. The big companies tend to just pay, and you tend to see one size fits all with an award that is made. And it is the small and medium-sized companies that are left out in this scenario, and it does not take into account the financial position of different companies. There is no flexibility. One of Graham Griffith's advisors was Nick Blaine, who ironically was one of my industrial relations lecturers at university. And as an aside, his father, Barney Blaine, the Reverend Barney Blaine, was our local minister at church and was one of the first Australians to enter Hiroshima with the military after the atom bomb was dropped in World War II. Nick's a quiet, understated, but a very experienced industrial relations practitioner. The policy that we developed was simple, and it was designed to combat this rigid system that was holding this country back. We wanted to provide flexibility to the rigid awards. You could choose to stay with an existing award, but these did not provide flexibility to take into account a worker's productivity or the business's capacity to pay. Or what we were putting in place was a new system of voluntary workplace agreements, either individual or collective, but with no employee forced into this system. It was designed to bring employers and employees closer together in their workplace. Our slogan was, "We will put the relations back into industrial relations." At the same time, we would ensure that protections were in place. In government, this became our Western Australian Minimum Conditions and Employment Act in 1993. The template we developed was later extended by a state Labor government in 2002 and nationally by federal Labor in 2009. John Howard was the Federal Shadow Minister for Industrial Relations in late 1992 under John Hewson's leadership. John Howard participated in our industrial relations workshop held here in Perth, where we were finalising our policies for the election. He was supportive of our approach, but insisted that the end goal should be a unified industrial relations framework covering all states and territories. We said this would be lunacy, as the last thing we wanted in Western Australia was a future federal Labor government dominated by the union muscle out of Victoria and New South Wales, in charge of a Canberra-inspired unified industrial relations system. In October 92, we publicly released a detailed 15-page industrial relations policy outlining what we would do if elected. That is, we would allow workplace agreements tailored for individual workplaces, a minimum safety net, allow individual contracts, no compulsion to leave the award system, promise to simplify a very complicated Industrial Relations Act, including repealing unnecessary legislation and modifying the role of the Industrial Relations Commission. In other words, we were supporting a truly federal system with our state government safeguarding what we saw as our key responsibility. It will become our Western Australian industrial relations model. And this is the major area where we disagree with the Howard government's approach. It's interesting to note that Jeff Kennett in Victoria actually handed his state's industrial relations responsibilities across to the federal government in 1996. But we believe that our approach would allow more flexibility, focus on productivity improvement, provide improved wages and conditions, create a happier workplace, and offer true freedom of choice. We won the election in 1993, in February, but John Hewson lost the federal election, which was held just a few weeks after our own election. Prime Minister Keating had done what he promised to do with John Hewson. I want to do you slowly. Given the extensive work that we'd already done, once elected, we moved quickly to introduce what became known as our first wave of industrial relations legislation. We did second Nick from the UWA to assist the Minister, and he was eventually employed during our 2 terms of government to help implement our new workplace culture. It took a while for the union movement to realise we were serious about introducing these changes. Minister Griffith was very open and accessible to the unions, but they did not want to listen. By the official opening of Parliament in June, just a few months after we were elected, there was the first major union rally outside of Parliament. The headline in the press the following day was "Ugly Clashes as Union Rally Erupts." Minister Griffith boldly addressed the rally and was severely booed down. You couldn't hear him speak, but he never budged from his commitment under pressure. The Governor could not arrive and inspect the traditional guard of honour at the opening of Parliament, and he had to enter through a side entrance. It was a massive rally. The unions had directed teachers and workers across a range of government operations to strike. However, despite growing protests, by November, we had our first industrial relations bills proclaimed. By Christmas, less than 10 months after we were elected, Rio was transferring workers across to workplace agreements. BHP and some of the other companies were slow to adopt this new work culture, but Rio got hold of it very quickly. Initially, the unions weren't sure how it would affect them, but when they saw the speed of take-up of workplace agreements, they moved very quickly to start ramping up their protests. The Pilbara was about to change. A major cultural shift in the way industrial relations was carried out was being put in place, and it ended up working effectively for the next 30 plus years until the current federal Labor legislation, which is allowing that union muscle to re-emerge. Wages and conditions immediately went on the up. Productivity went on the up. There was happiness in the workplace. Restrictive practices were gone. Crazy demarcation disputes disappeared, with workers who had previously been locked into certain workplace practices now were allowed to do multitasking and extending their skills experience. Demarcation disputes are when a ship comes in and only a certain person is allowed to tie up that ship, and that's their job. But when all this changed, you could tie the ship up, then you could go and load the ship. There were so many changes that improved productivity. But the key industrial relations battle had just begun. It peaked a few years later with Western Australia's own sort of Capitol Hill moment when the union protests took control of the Western Australian Parliament House. In October 1995, there was a 24-hour union blockade, not of Parliament House, but of Western Australia. It was agreed and organised by the WATLC and the ACTU. In fact, it was a stunt trying to make industrial relations a federal issue because they were going to the polls in 1996. The harder they protested, the more comfortable we were that we were on the right track. There's an old saying in politics, noise is not numbers. The numbers were the workforce willingly moving across to workplace agreements. Workplace agreements proved very popular in Western Australia. From December 93 through to January 99, there was over 160,000 agreements registered. In the 2000-2001 financial year alone, over 82,000 applications for registration. And by 2002, Western Australian workplace agreements in the resource sector had approximately 85% coverage of all employees. I repeat, 85% coverage of employees. The sector was, and still is today, the powerhouse of Australia's export earnings. But back to our torrid industrial relations journey. After the legislation had been operating for 2 years, Tony Cook, then the TLC President, Trades and Labour Council President, said of our first wave, the legislative agenda and the approach of state government has been effective, but he said our proposed second wave was too strong. We went to our late 1996 election again with this strong industrial relations policy. So what we see, we went to 2 elections with an industrial relations policy, and John Howard went to his election in 96 with an industrial relations policy. So when they say you can't take industrial relations policies to elections, we proved that that is not the case. In April 1997, there were statewide strikes and massive protest marches up to Parliament House, and effectively the operations of the upper house of our Parliament was hijacked. It was the brink of anarchy when the President of the Legislative Council was actually denied entry into Parliament House. And even some of the ALP members said that things had gone too far. But all I can summarise it and say is bringing about industrial relations reform is not for the faint-hearted. When the pressure is on, the first group to buckle are the big business community, who plead with you to back off. We never did. After all the key changes were eventually put in place, peace broke out in the Pilbara. So there's all this protesting going on in the city, but in the workplaces themselves, the change had already occurred. And John Howard, to his credit, he went to the 1996 federal election with an industrial relations policy along the lines that we'd already had in place in Western Australia. And that was the Australian Workplace Agreements Workplace Relations Act 1996. Peter Reith had a responsibility for this, and in his book, The Reith Papers, acknowledged what had been implemented successfully in Western Australia. But the overreach was when the Howard government gained control of the Senate after the 2004 federal election, and they introduced their Workplace Relations Amendment, Work Choices Act 2005, which was introduced in 2006. Instead of relying on the conciliation and arbitration powers, the work choice legislation relied heavily on the corporations' powers in Section 51 to regulate all trading, financial or foreign corporations and their employees. We saw this as a big mistake when it was first proposed in 1992 before we came into government, but they had a policy that a future coalition would seek complementary legislative action from state and territory governments to achieve the objectives of this policy. They were determined to implement this. It will, and I quote, "It will, if necessary, use whatever constitutional power is available to it, excluding the external affairs powers, to ensure that the benefits of this policy are as widely available as possible to Australians." And that is what they did. The overreaching was the coalition government's own goal, as it became very easy for the ALP to run some very effective scare campaigns. The federal system had been working as it should, allowing both the state and federal systems and the flexibility to move, to have choice between the systems. Our major industrial relations changes were made while Paul Keating was the Prime Minister. Now, I'd left politics by the time work choices legislation was proposed, but I wasted no time in trying to explain to federal coalition members the problems that they were creating. In simple terms, it gave the government in Canberra massive industrial relations powers. Big business was totally complicit. I contacted members of the Business Council of Australia, including writing to the then Vice President, Michael Chaney, in July 2005, outlining my concerns. His reply was that he bluntly disagreed with my concerns, and he said, "In my view, once the current round of industrial relations changes have been in operation for several years, winding back the clock will be impossible. The sensible size of the industrial relations legislated unit In my view, it is Australia, that Australia has a view rather than the states. Now, when he said it wouldn't be wound back, my view is it would be wound back in minutes. And I might add that that message that he gave was the same message, a consistent message that I received from many business leaders I approached. My view was that an incoming federal Labor government would dismantle this immediately. So I was not surprised when Michael in 2007 conceded it was a big disappointment. It has been an inability to sway Labor to change its stance on corporate workplace agreements. The union campaign resonating with the public has been very disappointing. Then again in 2014, fast forward, Michael, as a key member of Tony Abbott's new advisory council, called for the reintroduction of individual agreements to bolster productivity, which is what we'd already put in place in Western Australia. In fact, there's been a conga line of business leaders demanding industrial relations reform, but not fully understanding the curse of the unified approach when our country desperately needs flexibility in this area. The Rudd government moved quickly to introduce their proposals, particularly through their Fair Work Act 2009, and the Albanese government since 2021 has introduced major legislative changes with the so-called balance of power now strongly on the side of trade unions, with them using this power ruthlessly. I mean, the 5 pieces of legislation with names like the Secure Jobs Better Pay Act, that's a good one, and 2 all-encompassing acts called Closing Loopholes Acts 2023 and 2024. The Closing Loopholes Acts alone with their memorandums, cover over 800 pages. So federal coalitions since then have steered well clear of promoting industrial relations as an important election issue. And the federal Labor governments have enjoyed using the unified system's powers to try and rebuild, or they are rebuilding, union muscle. So federal coalitions leaders from then on have only fiddled at the edges. They've tried to tackle union governance, they've called for productivity reports, spoke of repair, not replacement, and they've proposed plenty of consultation. Even after Dyson Hayden, with us here tonight, his report into trade union governance and corruption had highlighted appalling governance. The corruption was widespread and deep-seated, with criminal behaviour in some unions. Even with that sort of information being made public, the union muscle continues to grow. We're now into the second term of the Albanese government. They were cock-a-hoop at the successful Jobs and Skills Summit in their first term. They got big runs on the boards for the unions, with the employer groups impotent, and this was the return of industry-wide bargaining. The iron ore industry is being reunionised. Unions are now trying to force companies to bargain, even if the majority of the workforce don't support it. The same job, same pay laws tend to lead to all being at the lowest common denominator, not a reward for individuals' productivity. As TWU boss Michael Caine said after the recent election, we must seize the moment. Well, they have. Employer groups have only taken a short-term view of the political process in the past and the roles that the state should be playing in a system. The current Canberra unified focus dulls competition, dulls innovation, lowers productivity, boosts the legal profession, boosts house prices in Canberra, and harms not just the resources sector but industry across the board. So it's important to understand why we have arrived where we are today. The future, we must aim for a return to flexibility in negotiations, closer to the individual in the workplace. We must be realistic about the need for both labour and capital to receive a fair return. We must keep legislation simple. The Fair Work legislation and its regulations and rules cover close to 3,000 pages. Lawyers salivate at this. Many in this room tonight. In government, we introduced 2 Industrial Relations Acts, but we repealed 6 redundant Industrial Relations Acts. a rare achievement in Australian politics. Wage increases do need to match inflation, but it is only with productivity improvements with labour and capital that grows real wages. In conclusion, I say that the Workplace Agreements Act 1993 in Western Australia was the most significant and fundamental reform of the Western Australian industrial relations system since the enactment of the original Conciliation and Arbitration Act in 1900 in Western Australia. And as I mentioned earlier, we did introduce flexibility, there was productivity growth, accident rates went down, real wages went up, happiness went up, the workplace was no longer a hostile, militant environment. And as I also mentioned, peace broke out in the Pilbara. Today, Australia's productivity growth has stalled at a time when our central government in Canberra assumes an even greater influence in key areas affecting productivity. What could possibly go wrong with such strong Canberra involvement in our economy? It's time to return flexibility to the industrial relations system. It's time to take energy policy out of the centre and make the states face up to their responsibilities in this area. And we need to return environmental approvals processes back to being a key state responsibility with limited federal oversight. Fortunately, in Western Australia, we are a separate state. And the Nullarbor Plain ensures that a lot of this Canberra nonsense gets lost in transportation, in translation and interpretation on its journey across the country. An industrial relations lawyer once said to me, "With industrial relations there are no winners, only survivors." That is not true. We demonstrated in Western Australia that we could change the work culture with labour and capital both being winners. At the end of the day, if a business is not profitable, jobs disappear. If new investment is driven overseas for different reasons, new jobs are not created. If the main employment growth is in the government sector, which it is at present, that is not sustainable. Industrial relations is just one important component in ensuring that Australians can continue to enjoy the lifestyle to which we have become accustomed. It was so pleasing to see so many younger delegates here tonight at this conference, many for the first time. And I hope that I have shown why I am involved with the Samuel Griffith Society, because it fights to ensure that our Constitution works as the state leaders who agreed to establish our federation in the first place envisaged it to operate. And trust me, it's an ongoing battle. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, and on behalf of the Society, I do want to thank you for that excellent presentation, bar the pot shots at the industrial relations lawyers. Richard and his late father, Sir Charles Court, have left a remarkable legacy here in WA, in particular opening up the Pilbara for iron ore and leading new LNG markets. I cannot think of one family that's had such an impact on WA, the benefits of which all of the residents and the Commonwealth continue to reap the rewards of today. As a result, WA is now the powerhouse and perhaps the envy of the Federation. So thank you again, Richard, for everything that you have done and continue to do, including again for such a wonderful dinner speech. Thank you.